Dear humans of the great nation known as YouTube, welcome back to the darkest corner of your peculiar little universe, where the stars don't twinkle, they blink, where stories are like signal flares drifting in vacuum. This is Humans, Space, Noir. Every Wednesday, a new tale, grim, gritty, glorious. So before we lose signal, like, subscribe, and comment below. It helps us climb your strange algorithmic temple. And trust me, we're watching you. Now dim the lights. Let's begin. David McGuire was alone, farther from home than any human had ever been. He stood at the observation port of S1E1, the lonely outpost clinging to the edge of the Boötes Void, and gazed into darkness. On one side of the sky, behind him, distant galaxies glimmered like specks of sugar. On the other side stretched the great nothing, a starless expanse so vast and empty it made his stomach clench. The void spanned 300 million light-years across, containing almost nothing, 60 galaxies adrift in a colossal black sea where 2,000 should have been. They called it the Great Void, or the Great Nothing, and in David's mind, no name ever felt more apt. He pressed a palm to the cold glass. A faint vibration hummed through the station's hull, the life support system cycling air, the distant thrum of the signal array. Otherwise, silence. S1E1 had been designed for a crew of 3, but David was its sole occupant now. He had arrived 2 days ago, a week behind schedule due to a navigation glitch in his transit shuttle. The delay meant he missed the outgoing crew's handoff. When he boarded, the living quarters were empty and still, the only signs of the previous scientists being a few forgotten personal effects. A dog-eared paperback novel floating in zero-G, a coffee mug emblazoned with NASA's crest, cold coffee still coating the bottom. The crew was already en route back to civilized space, leaving David entirely isolated. He settled into the routine quickly. He had no choice. Each day he woke at what passed for morning, following a 24-hour Earth schedule to keep sane. He performed equipment checks, calibrated the radio telescopes and FTL comms, logged the cosmic microwave background readings. The mission was straightforward: monitor deep space signals and cosmic phenomena from the universe's quietest vantage. At the cusp of the Boötes Void, there was minimal galactic noise. Here it was expected to be silent, the perfect place to listen for whispers from the stars, but the silence had a weight. In quiet moments, David found himself straining to hear something, anything, beyond the drone of machinery and his own heartbeat. Sometimes he imagined he could hear the void itself, a yawning emptiness pressing in. During mealtimes, he'd play music or recordings of chatter from mission control just to simulate a normal environment. Still, the vast emptiness outside the walls always lurked in his thoughts. On the third day, during a routine scan, David noticed a blip on the spectral analysis. He frowned and leaned over the console. In the soundless vacuum of the void, the instruments had picked up something. A signal, faint and fleeting, had registered on the radio spectrum. At first he assumed it was a glitch, cosmic rays or a stray reflection from a known source. He ran the signal through filters, checking for known pulsar signatures, quasars, any natural pattern. It didn't match. The pulse was too regular, too intentional, a slow, steady beat at a frequency that had no business coming from the emptiness of the void. David's throat tightened as he isolated the signal. It was repeating every 10 seconds, a soft ping that slid right to the edge of detection and then disappeared, only to return again, like a beacon or a call. He recorded several minutes of it and initiated an analysis. There was no encoded message, no identifiers, no modulation beyond that basic pulse. It wasn't any Earthship or relay. He double-checked the registry of all known spacecraft beacons. Nothing matched. And it was originating from deep within the void, well beyond the handful of galaxies drifting in that cosmic desert. Impossible, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his short, copper-brown hair. His voice was jarringly loud in the cramped communications module. He realized he was sweating. Could it be an error? Some reflection from the Hercules supercluster at the void's fringe? The system's calibration was correct, he was sure of that, and the direction was unmistakable, smack in the middle of the great nothing. He knew what protocol demanded: report any anomalous signals immediately and do not respond unless instructed. David exhaled slowly, forcing calm. He typed up a quick preliminary report to Earth. Unidentified signal detected. Origin: approximate center of Boötes Void. Nature: repeating pulse. Interval 10 sec. No known source. Investigating further. Will not transmit response without clearance. He sent the message off via the FTL com link, hoping for a swift reply despite the distance. The miniature wormhole comms were supposed to be nearly instantaneous, a miracle of modern physics, but even FTL relays had delays or outages this far out. The signal continued softly pinging in the background. David listened to it for a while through the station's audio output, a low, intermittent beeping that felt oddly alive. Each time it sounded, he felt a gentle tug of something. Curiosity. A strange emotion he couldn't quite name. It was as if the signal was patiently waiting. Calling, but not with urgency. It was inviting a response. He found himself reaching toward the transmitter controls more than once, only to pull his hand back. "Don't be an idiot," he whispered. Responding blindly to an unknown signal was reckless. Who knew what or who was on the other end? It could be an alien beacon, or a trap, or even some natural phenomenon that could overload his systems if he interacted with it incorrectly. He was isolated and vulnerable. Contacting an unknown could make him even more so. Still, he felt the call in his bones. Each ping set his teeth on edge, like a distant echo inside his skull. After hours of enduring its patient beeping, David muted the audio feed. He couldn't mute the knowledge that it was still there, though, steadily pulsing in his readouts. Earth didn't answer that day. The outpost's comlog showed his reporters sent, but no reply came back through the wormhole link. Possibly the message had been received and was being analyzed by higher-ups, or perhaps the distance and alignment meant a delay. It wasn't unheard of for the FTL com network to have hiccups out here. Regardless, as the station's lights dimmed to mimic night, David was left with uncertainty. He tried to sleep, but the signal's presence nagged at him. Lying in his bunk, he stared up at a photograph taped to the ceiling. A smiling woman with freckles and deep blue eyes, throwing a peace sign at the camera. His partner, Marisol. He smiled back at the picture in the dark. Marisol was back on Earth, likely just starting her workday at the university lab. The thought of her steadied him. He resolved that in the morning, if Earth still hadn't responded, he'd send a follow-up and perhaps adjust the array to pinpoint the source more precisely. There was no rush to answer the signal itself. It would just have to wait, whoever or whatever it was. When morning came, David was at the comm station again, sipping rehydrated coffee that tasted vaguely of plastic. His bleary eyes scanned the overnight logs. The signal was still there, pinging consistently. He had gathered enough data to determine an approximate distance. It truly was from the void's center region, hundreds of millions of light years away. Technically impossible that such a steady signal could even reach him through that gulf intact. But it was here. As he pondered that, a notification blinked on the console, an incoming message from Earth. Finally. He opened the channel with anticipation, expecting a reply from Mission Control or maybe Dr. Nguyen, the project lead, with instructions. Instead, a familiar face filled the small communication screen, Marisol. It was not a live video call. Out here everything came as recorded packets, but her smile was as real and bright as if she stood right there. David's heart leapt. He hadn't expected a personal message so soon. They'd scheduled a video call for the end of the week. He quickly paused the data scanners and turned up the volume. Marisol's voice came through warm and a little shaky, as if she'd been crying happy tears. "Hey, love," she began, a grin tugging at her lips. Behind her, David recognized the sunlit kitchen of their apartment. "Surprise. I know it's not our scheduled time, but I couldn't wait. I have news, big news." She took a breath, and in that moment, David's pulse quickened. Her eyes were shimmering. "David, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." David sat down heavily in the console chair, the breath knocked out of him. Did he hear that right? Marisol laughed on the video, a soft, joyous sound. "I found out 2 days after you left. I wanted to be sure, went to the doctor, and it's confirmed. I'm about 8 weeks along. I wish more than anything you were here right now. I know the timing isn't ideal, but we've always handled worse, right?" She wiped her eyes. "I love you. We'll talk soon, I promise. I just needed you to know. You're going to be a father, David." The message ended with her blowing a kiss to the camera, her hand resting on her belly. The video looped back to the start frame of her smiling face as the playback stopped. David realized he was trembling. A father. He was going to be a father. A laugh escaped him, half joy, half disbelief. "A dad," he whispered into the empty room. The word felt unreal in his mouth. Tears pricked his eyes, and he let them fall freely, unashamed in his solitude. Marisol's news filled him with warmth, with longing, and also a pang of guilt that he wasn't there beside her. He touched the screen where her face had been, then the photo on the ceiling above. "I love you too," he said softly. He replayed her message twice, letting each word soak in. For a short while, he forgot all about the mysterious signal or the void outside. All he wanted was to share this moment with someone, and there was no one. That sudden loneliness cut deep. He should be popping champagne with her, holding her, celebrating together. Instead, he was hundreds of millions of light years away, alone in a tin can on the edge of emptiness. "Well, if there's ever a reason to break out the good stuff," he murmured. David floated to one of the storage lockers and unlocked a personal compartment. From within a sealed pouch behind his spare socks, he withdrew a small stainless steel flask. The mission protocol forbade alcohol on remote postings, but one of the crew members he replaced had quietly mentioned the tradition of bringing a little moonshine for special occasions or emergencies. David had come prepared with a bit of contraband, a strong homebrew whiskey given as a parting gift by a friend. He had planned to save it for the end of his lonely rotation, or maybe a particularly rough day. This news was reason enough. He poured a capful and held it up in a mock toast. The amber liquid caught the sterile overhead light. "To Marisol and our baby," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "To the future." He downed the shot. The liquor burned hot and satisfying down his throat, coiling in his stomach. A laugh bubbled up again, more relaxed now. God, he was happy and aching with the desire to be home. But he'd make do. He poured another, larger this time, and sipped. Outside the viewport, the darkness of the void stretched implacably, but David's mind was elsewhere, imagining his child's face, the look on Marisol's face when he would return, how he'd swing their kid up in his arms and tell stories of how far Daddy had traveled, how he had touched the edge of the universe and come back. He lost track of how many capfuls he drank. Alone, there was no one to moderate his toasts. Warmth and alcohol flushed through him, smoothing the edges of his solitude and the strange day he'd had. At some point he put on music, an old jazz piece Marisol loved, and let it loop in the background as he drifted in the cramped galley, imagining it was their kitchen back home. He even danced a slow, floating waltz by himself, eyes closed, pretending she was in his arms. The whiskey made the fantasy vivid. When he opened his eyes, he found himself back at the communications console, though he didn't quite recall floating there. The room swayed gently. He steadied himself on the console edge. On one of the screens, the signal monitor still showed that persistent pulse from the void. A tiny green waveform blipping at its steady interval, almost like a heartbeat. David blinked and leaned closer. In his inebriated haze, the single blip looked lonely, waiting. He felt an unexpected swell of empathy toward it. Here he was, celebrating news with no one but the silence, and here was this signal calling out from unimaginable distance, also unanswered. Both of them, lonely voices in an expanse of nothing. He hiccuped and tapped the screen. "You and me both, eh?" he slurred softly. On impulse, he opened the transmission interface and selected the array that had been receiving the signal. A cursor blinked in the text field where he could compose a reply or send a ping back. "What am I doing?" he muttered, yet his fingers moved to key in a basic acknowledgement code, a simple electronic handshake that said, "I hear you." It was against protocol, a terrible idea, some sober part of him warned, but the whiskey and the euphoria made him bold, or at least careless. "Just one reply, just to see," he whispered. "Can't leave someone hanging." He typed the code. His hand hovered over the transmit button. He hesitated, a last glimmer of caution surfacing. Through his haze, he tried to recall the regulation forbidding this. Do not respond to unknown signals alone. But then he pictured Marisol's joyful tears again, the life growing inside her. He felt invincible for a moment, part of the grand human story reaching across space, and terribly, achingly alone. To the void, David announced grandly to the empty room, raising an imaginary glass. Then he pressed send. The console blinked as the transmission shot out into the abyss. A tiny packet of energy dispatched toward that faint source. The deed was done. David exhaled, a nervous giggle escaping him. He waited, eyes locked on the receiver readout for any change. Would it respond? Would it stop? For a minute, nothing changed. The ping continued as before, indifferent. David sighed, half relieved, half disappointed. "So much for," he began to say, and then hiccuped again. His head was spinning more intensely now. The adrenaline and alcohol were catching up to him in a bad way. The room tilted, and he had to grab the chair to orient himself. He drifted toward his bunk, deciding he desperately needed to lie down. The signal reply could wait until morning, if it even replied at all. Perhaps the whole thing was silly. Perhaps he'd laugh about this later. David collapsed onto his bunk without bothering to undress. The last thing he saw before sleep overtook him was that photograph of Marisol on the ceiling, smiling down. He closed his eyes, and darkness took him. He did not remember the dreams that came in the night, only that they were heavy and unsettling. Fragments clung to him upon waking, the sensation of someone whispering his name from far away, and an image of a vast black ocean closing over his head. A metallic banging noise jolted him fully awake. He sat up, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The station's lights had shifted to morning mode, pale and clinical. His head throbbed with a vicious hangover. His mouth was dry and tasted of copper. The banging came again, a dull thud from somewhere in the station's hull. Another echoing clang reverberated through the metal floor under his feet, then silence. David's mind raced. The sound wasn't a normal station noise. Instinctively, he checked the environmental monitors. Pressure stable, no hull breaches detected. Perhaps a thermal contraction or a stray micrometeor strike. He didn't see any alarms, which was reassuring. He rubbed his eyes and tried to focus. The last evening flooded back into his awareness in disordered flashes. Marisol's news, the whiskey, the signal. The signal. He had answered it, hadn't he? Or had that been a drunken hallucination? His stomach lurched as he swung out of the bunk. The empty flask drifted nearby, a mute testament to the night's excess. He snatched it out of the air and clipped it to a Velcro patch on the wall, scowling at his own lack of discipline. Then he hurried to the communications console. The analysis display showed only background noise now. The repeating ping was gone. David felt a spike of panic. He toggled through the recorded spectrum data. The signal had ceased at some point during the night. The last logged instance was, he scrolled, around 0200 station time, which might have been shortly after he'd sent his unauthorized reply. He checked the outgoing log. Sure enough, there it was. A single packet transmitted from Epsilon 13 to the void coordinates at 0113. He had actually done it. A leaden dread settled into his gut, cutting through the lingering haze of the hangover. In his stupor, he had answered the call. Okay, don't panic, he mumbled. His voice sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the metal walls. He cleared his throat and swallowed the sour taste in his mouth. Perhaps nothing bad would come of it. Maybe it was nothing at all. Just an experiment from some distant civilization that wouldn't even notice his tiny blip of a response. Or a natural phenomenon that simply coincidentally stopped around that time. Correlation isn't causation, he tried to reassure himself. He needed coffee and data. David pushed off towards the galley and hydrated a pack of strong coffee, gulping it down hot to shock himself into full alertness. His hands shook slightly, whether from nerves or the aftermath of alcohol, he wasn't sure. The metallic banging he'd heard earlier, was that real? He hadn't imagined it, had he? He spent the next several hours combing through all station systems for anomalies. Power, nominal. Life support, nominal. Structural integrity, nominal. External cameras, nothing out of the ordinary, just the same stark view of star-speckled space on one side and the inky void on the other. He even ran a manual visual inspection by floating through the station's small observatory dome with a high-powered flashlight, shining it through each window to look for any external impact or debris. Nothing. The hull was fine. The signal remained silent. He scanned the frequencies repeatedly, extending the range just in case the source had shifted bands. Space remained quiet, aside from the usual faint hiss of cosmic background radiation. It was as if the mysterious pulse had never existed. David tapped his foot anxiously against the floor grill. If his reply had reached someone, what would they do? Perhaps they stopped because they got what they wanted, confirmation of a listening ear. Perhaps now they were considering a response, or preparing something else. His skin crawled at the thought, but he tried to be rational. More likely, it was a curiosity, and his response was meaningless. Earth had not yet answered his anomaly report, or the likely flagged unauthorized transmission. Perhaps outpost communications were still on a delay or experiencing interference. Or maybe Mission Control was deliberating on a reprimand for his breach of protocol. He decided to get ahead of it and sent another message. Update. Signal ceased at 0200 ST. Possible transient phenomenon. Continuing observation. Minor incident last night after personal news. Apologies for any irregularities in log. He kept it vague. That day passed slowly. David went through motions, running maintenance, cleaning the already spotless station, eating a tasteless lunch pack. He felt edgy, like an unseen gaze was on his back. Several times he thought he heard something just at the edge of hearing, a faint high-pitched tone or a rustling whisper behind a wall panel. Each time he paused and held his breath, listening. The noises never repeated clearly, leaving him uncertain if they were real or just his imagination and a pounding headache playing tricks. He chalked it up to hangover and nerves. Isolation plus a bad night could do that. Still, he found himself turning music or the recorded mission control chatter back on whenever silence fell too heavy, just to drown out any stray creaks or his own thoughts. That night, David's sleep was fitful. He dreamed of Marisol's face, but she was on the other side of a thick glass wall, and he couldn't hear what she was saying. Behind her was the universe, but all the stars were going out one by one until only darkness remained around her. In the dream, he pounded on the glass, shouting, but no sound came. She just kept mouthing words he couldn't hear, tears running down her face. He woke with a start, heart racing. The cabin was dark except for the gentle amber glow of the night lights. He could have sworn he still saw a silhouette at the foot of his bunk. It looked like a person standing there. He yelped in surprise, scrambling up and nearly hitting his head on the low ceiling. The silhouette vanished. No one was there. Just the afterimage on his retinas and a vacuum of silence. He ran a hand over his face. "Get a grip, McGuire," he whispered to himself. "No one's here but you." He drifted out of bed and did a quick sweep through the adjacent modules, just to reassure himself. Of course, he found nothing but dim corridors and the hum of electronics. Still, the adrenaline refused to ease up. He didn't want to go back to sleep, not after that nightmare. So he returned to the comm station and decided to check if Earth had sent any reply while he slept. What he saw puzzled him. There were fragments of a transmission from Earth, but it was corrupted. The log indicated an incoming message had been partially received around 3 a.m. station time, but it was incomplete and flagged with a data integrity warning. Maybe the comm relay had a glitch. He hit replay and listened. A burst of static filled the speakers, and under it, for a second, he thought he heard a voice. He leaned closer, straining. Through the crackling static, a distorted sound emerged. "David. Ksh. Respond. Kst. You. Here. Shk." His blood turned to ice. That was definitely Mission Control's voice. It sounded like Lucille, one of the communication officers, but the words were broken. Then another voice cut in briefly, laden with static. "This is Ksh. Control. Do you copy? Over." Then a loud whine of interference made David wince and pull off the headset. The message was lost. He tried to ping back through the channel. "This is Epsilon 13, David McGuire. I read you partially, Control. Please repeat." No answer. The channel was dead silent, not even static now. He checked the comm systems. The carrier link was solid green. So why? He played the fragment again and again, trying to parse it. It sounded urgent, like they were trying to reach him, but why was it garbled? The wormhole link shouldn't have static or interference like an OD long-range radio. It either works or it doesn't. Perhaps the message was cut off, or the station's systems were glitching. David swallowed, or something was interfering with it. He suddenly thought of the unknown signal. Could it have disrupted his comms? There was no evidence of that, but the timing gnawed at him. The signal appears, he responds, then it stops. And now his secure link to Earth is acting up. It could be coincidence, or not. He decided to run a thorough diagnostic on the communication array. As he worked, he spoke aloud, partly to fill the silence, partly to log notes for later review. Running com diagnostics, hardware check. Wormhole communicate and sync is within normal parameters. Attempting to resend handshake to Earth. It was all routine, and everything seemed fine on his end. Yet, when he tried to send a test message to Earth, the system stalled on transmitting for an unusually long time before confirming send. Receiving still returned nothing. At a loss, David resorted to the backup method, an older subspace radio transmitter that was painfully slow and mostly meant for emergency beacons. It wouldn't reach Earth for ages by normal means, but it could reach the nearest manned relay station in a few hours, perhaps. He composed a short distress message. Comms compromised, unable to reach Earth via primary channel. Please advise. All well, but experiencing technical anomalies. S1E1. He directed it to a relay outpost orbiting a distant colony some 100 million light-years behind him. It was a long shot, but protocol demanded redundancy. With that done, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. The faint headache from earlier had never fully gone away. He hadn't had a real meal since the day before, he realized. Perhaps low blood sugar and stress were making him hallucinate noises and shadows. Yes, that made sense. He should eat, maybe do some exercise to get endorphins going. He made his way to the galley and forced down a protein bar and a pouch of synthetic stew. It tasted like cardboard, but it was fuel. Afterward, he jogged in place and did some zero-G push-ups, going through the motions of his daily fitness routine. The physical exertion calmed him somewhat. It was comforting, normal. By the time he'd broken a sweat, he felt a bit more himself. Returning to the control module, he resolved to focus on work, something concrete. If the mysterious signal was gone, fine. He'd treat it as a resolved anomaly unless it returned. Better to concentrate on his actual research duties. Perhaps scanning a different sector of space, collecting data for the astrophysics team back home on cosmic background fluctuations. Anything to occupy his brain with familiar tasks. Several hours passed. S1E1 circled slowly around its anchor point, a distant star's faint gravity well, and the view outside the portholes gradually shifted. Now the bulk of the void yawned below the station like an endless abyss, and above, the sparse stars of the Hercules supercluster twinkled. David tried not to look out too often. He kept his eyes on screens and readouts. Normalcy returned, bit by bit. It was perhaps mid-afternoon by station time when he caught himself nodding off at his desk. He decided to take a short break, maybe a power nap, since he hadn't gotten good rest. He closed his eyes right there at the console, figuring a few minutes wouldn't hurt. He was awoken by the sound of footsteps. David jerked upright, disoriented. He glanced at the doorway behind him, toward the sound, but saw nothing. Just the empty corridor leading toward the airlock and storage. The noise had been so clear, definite clanking footfalls on the metal floor grates, as if someone heavy had walked just past the doorway. He floated out of his chair and moved cautiously into the hall. "Hello?" he called, voice cracking. Absurd. Who was he expecting to answer? No one was here. The station was sealed. The airlock indicators showed it hadn't cycled since his arrival. He peered around the corner. The corridor was empty, lit by the overhead strips casting harsh white light and shadows in the grid of the deck plating. He looked down at his socked feet on the metal floor. He'd taken off his boots during the break. Perhaps he'd heard his own footfalls as he shifted while sleeping. But no, he'd distinctly heard multiple steps, like someone walking normally. For the first time, he truly felt fear creeping into his gut. The imagination is powerful when you're alone, he reasoned. Perhaps some sound from the station's thermal creaking had coincidentally resembled footsteps to his half-sleeping brain. David forced himself to return to his seat, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced behind him more than once. The third time he did it, he caught a flicker of movement in the reflection of a dark computer monitor. By the time he spun around, there was nothing, of course. Only the slight flicker of the overhead lights, which were known to dim momentarily when certain systems cycled. Perfectly normal. Perfectly normal. He let out a shuddering breath. "This is getting to me. I need proper sleep," he said, attempting to reassure himself with the sound of his own voice. Talking to oneself was not a great sign of mental stability, but it broke the tension. He resolved to take a sleeping aid that night, a mild sedative in his med kit, to ensure he got rest. That evening he tried to unwind by writing a message to Marisol. Even if comms were unstable, the station would keep the outgoing message queued until it could send. He poured out his feelings, congratulating her again, apologizing for not being there, promising he'd be back before the baby's birth, that he loved her. He kept it upbeat and didn't mention any of the strange events or how scared he was beginning to feel. No need to worry her or come across as losing it. He saved the recording and set it to transmit when possible. After that, he took the sedative, killed the lights, and drifted off with Marisol's photo in his hand. For the first time since he arrived, he experienced a dreamless sleep. No nightmares, only a heavy, dark slumber. It might have lasted hours. When consciousness crept back, David felt an odd pressure in his ears, as though he were underwater or in a pressurized cabin descending too fast. He opened his eyes to pitch black. Startled, he wondered if the station had lost power. He could feel himself floating, and faint red emergency LEDs provided just enough glow to outline the contours of his bunk and the corridor beyond. The main lights were indeed off. The hum of systems was quieter than usual, replaced by a subtle ringing in his ears. Power outage. His heart thudded as he instinctively reached out in the dark, finding the handle to pull himself out of the bunk. Emergency mode meant something had gone very wrong, yet no alarms were sounding, and the air, it tasted metallic. He blinked, trying to cast off the drowsiness from the drug. A coppery, tangy taste clung to the back of his tongue with each breath, and the air felt heavy, humid. As he floated into the corridor, a faint sloshing sound reached his ears, sloshing like liquid against metal. Every instinct screamed that shouldn't be possible. Liquids in open air meant a leak. Did a water tank rupture? He tapped the panel on the wall to trigger auxiliary power. Dim overhead lights flickered on, bathing the corridor in weak yellow. What he saw made no sense at first. Small, glistening droplets floated all around, like a swarm of dark, glittering orbs in the zero-G environment. Some were water-like, but others clung in viscous smears to the walls and ceiling. A larger blob of fluid drifted past his face, and David reflexively kicked off the wall to avoid it. It splattered against the opposite bulkhead, and where it hit, he heard a faint sizzle. Alarmed, he pushed himself toward the main control module. "System, what's the status?" he barked. No response. The AI was down, presumably with main power. The emergency lights meant the station was running on minimal reserve batteries. At the entrance to the control room, David stopped cold. The large window that dominated the far wall, the one that had looked out into space, was a void of pure black. Not the normal black of space speckled with stars. This was absolute total darkness, as if something had covered the entire window. He saw his own pale reflection trembling there, backlit by the dim interior lights. Outside that glass there should have been at least a hint of the cosmos, the glow of distant galaxies, the faint smear of the Milky Way far behind, something. Instead, it was like someone had painted over the outpost with black ink. He felt dread coiling in his stomach. Fighting it, he propelled himself to the communications console and tried to bring up any system info. The panels were unpowered. Only a few indicators blinked here and there. The main power systems were offline entirely now. How? Why? The sloshing sound came again, louder now, and a new sound, a groan of metal under strain. David's eyes darted to the corner of the control room where a junction of wall panels met. There, a dark liquid was oozing through the seam. It trickled in slow, globular rivulets, breaking into floating droplets. The liquid was nearly black, but with a faint, oily iridescence. As he watched, one of the larger droplets fell onto a console surface. Instantly, the metal beneath it began to smoke and pit. The droplet hissed, eating a small, corroded hole before drifting off. "Acid?" David gasped. He looked around in growing panic. More of the fluid was seeping in from multiple points: the seams of the airlock door at the far end of the corridor, the ventilation grate above, even a hairline crack near one of the window edges. Each tendril of liquid moved unnaturally, as if driven by pressure or perhaps by its own motive force. And wherever it touched, the material of the station blistered and dissolved with a sickening quiet. A shudder ran through the hull, a low vibration accompanied by another tortured groan of metal. It sounded like the station was being squeezed. David's mind snapped into survival mode. He had to get out or seal off sections or something. But where to go? The only way out was the airlock, and that was clearly where some of this stuff was coming from, plus whatever was outside. He suddenly understood. The darkness outside wasn't just absence of light. Something was enveloping the station, clinging to it. Something vast and alive, secreting acidic fluid and eating its way in. The signal hadn't just been a call, it had been bait, and he had answered. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, oh God." He launched himself toward the tiny emergency locker. Inside were a few tools and a flare gun for signaling rescuers, along with an EVA suit. The suit, if he could don it and maybe cut loose in the escape pod. Did this station even have a real escape pod? The design was so small, but yes, there was a one-person re-entry capsule meant for emergency departure, but if something had fully covered the station, launching a pod might just deliver him into its clutches. Still, what choice? Stay and melt or try to escape? David pulled the EVA suit from the locker and started shoving his legs in. The sticky fluid was now forming pools in the zero-G, some clinging to corners. A drop brushed his arm. It burned through the thin sleep shirt instantly and into his skin. He yelled, batting the droplet away. It left a small smoking hole in his sleeve and a searing pain on his forearm. Gritting his teeth, he resumed suiting up, ignoring the tremble in his hands. He got the suit on up to his waist and was reaching for the upper half when an impact rocked the station. He was thrown against the wall, then the ceiling as the structure lurched. He realized with horror that gravity had momentarily returned in that jolt. The station was being pulled, accelerating. Loose objects and globules of acid splattered downward, then drifted again as whatever force had gripped it stabilized. The emergency lights flickered. One went out entirely, plunging the far end of the corridor in darkness. The table in the galley had been bolted to the floor, but his chair was free-floating. It had slammed hard into a wall during the jolt and now bounced slowly in the air. More fluid leaked from the new dents its legs punched into the wall. David coughed. The air was growing pungent and metallic-smelling as more surfaces corroded. Some chemical mist, perhaps. The station's life support still ran on emergency, trying to scrub the air, but it wouldn't keep up if this got worse. He had to hurry. He grabbed the upper torso of the EVA suit. It was cumbersome in zero-G, a hard-shelled life support backpack and helmet attached. As he struggled to get his head and arms into it, something slammed into the window from outside. The sound was like a wet thud, followed by a squeal of rending metal. David's eyes darted to the viewport. Through the black film covering it, he saw a faint indent, a change in pressure. It looked like something pressed against the glass, smearing across it. Then a thin line appeared in the transparency, a crack. If the window breached, the station would decompress, possibly explosively if any pocket of air escaped, though with the entire hull seemingly compromised and this stuff seeping in, maybe decompression was the least of his worries. He managed to seal the EVA suit torso to the lower half and started locking it. The suit's internal HUD flickered on inside the helmet as he sealed it. Air hissed, pressurizing. Thank God the suit had independent life support. He'd have fresh air for a little while at least. He clamped the helmet shut and was reaching for the emergency flare gun, maybe useless, but he didn't want to be completely unarmed, when another mighty groan came from the hull. The lights died entirely this time. He was plunged into darkness, save for the suit's headlamp, which he quickly switched on. A cone of light illuminated the corridor. His stomach dropped as he saw that the far end of the hall, where the airlock was now gaping open. Not completely. The inner airlock door still held, but around its edges, black fluid poured in, dissolving the door's perimeter. The metal was warping. That door wouldn't hold much longer. Beyond it, through a growing hole, was the blackness of whatever lay outside. And in that blackness, just for a second, David thought he saw something fleshy, pulsating flesh draped over strong muscles that contracted, visible through the gap. It looked eerily familiar, but then submerged back into shadow. David's breath caught in a scream that never made it past his tightening throat. He fired the flare gun on instinct, and a brilliant magnesium-red flare shot down the corridor. It sailed through the airlock gap into the void outside. For a moment, the corridor glowed red and shadows danced wildly. In that strobing instant, he glimpsed something massive pressed around the station, fleshy, dark surfaces like the inside tissue of a stomach all around the hull. He remembered when he saw such tissue in university, and this pace looked shockingly the same. The flare fizzled out in seconds, swallowed by the darkness, but the image was burned into his mind. The void was not empty. It was alive, and it had swallowed him. The station was being devoured, and Avid was being eaten alive. A deep vibration reverberated through the station again. Not just a physical force, but a sound. A low-frequency drone that resonated inside David's chest, like the distant moan of a gigantic whale. It was the same pattern. Oh God, it was the same 10-second interval pulse, now transformed into a physical tremor. It had been a call, and now it was a voice. A terrible, inhuman voice just outside the walls. The inner airlock door finally gave way, melting into slag as fluid gushed in. The creature's substance, or secretions or whatever it was, flooded the corridor in a slow-motion wave. Some clung to the ceiling and moved with a mind of its own, reaching out in tendrils that quested and grasped. David staggered back into the control room and shut the hatch, sealing it. It had a manual wheel lock, which he spun frantically. He knew it wouldn't hold it out indefinitely, but it might buy a minute. The main viewport window cracked further with a sharp pop. A thin spiderweb of fractures spread across it. The blackness outside was pressing inward. David whimpered despite himself. The rational part of his mind had long since been overtaken by primal terror. He climbed up onto the central table, one of the only pieces of furniture sturdily anchored to the floor. If the station suddenly reoriented or gravity returned, he didn't want to be dumped into the pool of acid that was surely forming below. Even now, blobs of the fluid were seeping in around the edges of the closed hatch door behind him, sizzling on the floor. From his higher perch atop the table, David could see nearly the whole room in the glow of his suit lamp. The floor was a nightmare of smoking holes and floating globs of darkness. Panels on the walls were corroding, revealing sparking wires. The station was dying around him, being digested piece by piece. He panted, tears of fear and despair mixing with sweat on his face inside the helmet. In a brief lucid moment, he realized this was likely the end. Even if he got to the escape capsule and launched, where would he go? He'd be launching into the maw of an unknown monster in the middle of a void, with no rescue for unimaginable distances. Earth wouldn't even know what happened. His messages might never reach them. Marisol would... She'd never know exactly how he died, only that he never came home. At that thought, a sob escaped his lips. On the table, he curled into himself for a moment, mind flooding with images of his wife, her laughter, her eye rolling at his nerdy jokes, her face as she told him he'd be a father, their unborn child, who he would never get to hold or even see. He felt an overwhelming guilt. He had gotten himself into this. If he hadn't answered the damn signal, maybe none of this would be happening. In a final act, David activated his suit's emergency beacon. It would broadcast a distress call on all frequencies, a futile scream into the void. He knew no help would come in time, but it was the last thing he could do. He also tapped the suit's recorder, his voice trembling as he spoke into his helmet mic. "This is David McGuire of S1E1, final log," he panted. "If anyone ever hears this, the void isn't empty, the void isn't empty. I think I made a mistake. To Marisol, I love you. Live a good life for our baby. I'm sorry I won't be there." A sob choked his words. The hatch behind him finally gave with a screech, and a flood of black acidic fluid gushed into the control room like blood from a wound. It hissed against the floor, rising in a rippling pool. The table's bolted legs began to dissolve, listing to one side. David curled up on its surface, back against the wall, drawing his knees to his chest. The station structure trembled around him as another deep vibration, the creature's call, that awful 10-second pulse made manifest, reverberated through the hull. In the flicker of his failing headlamp, David saw the darkness outside the shattered window shift and seethe. Something was out there, pressing against the station. Through the crazed web of cracks in the viewport, he thought he caught the glint of a colossal form, an appendage, a glimpse of an eye. But he could no longer trust his senses. The acid was inching over the table's edge now, tendrils of burning liquid reaching towards David like hungry fingers. He felt his boots begin to smoke where droplets touched them. The acrid scent of charred material and the metallic taste of decay filled the air. There was nowhere left to go. David McGuire sat alone on the table in the dissolving ruin of S1E1, utterly terrified. He pressed himself into the corner, hands clasped around his knees, as the black tide rose to meet him. His final scream echoed in the small chamber, a raw animal sound of despair that was cut short as the darkness closed in. The emergency recorder captured only a last fragment of his broken transmission before all fell silent. "This is David. Ksht. Not empty. Ksht. No escape. Shh." And then the Boötes Void was quiet once more, as if nothing had ever been there at all. You made it, didn't you? All the way through that long, slow scream into the abyss. Thanks for sticking with us on this descent into dread. We hope your sleep is light, your thoughts are heavier, and you'll return next week for more whispers from the dark. If you liked this tale of cosmic shadows, please like, subscribe, ring that little bell so we can haunt your feed, and if you'd like to support the madness, our Patreon welcomes brave souls with open airlocks. And now take care, dear humans. Fuck yeah.